It was an idyllic, peaceful city, nestled among the rolling hills of the continental Midwest. Not too big, not too small, timeless. It was little enough to have just one post office, one railway station, and one Chinese restaurant. It was big enough to have one professional sports team, one famous hometown celebrity, and one small concert hall with its very own homegrown orchestra. In Jamestown, however, the most legendary of these was the concert hall. Not that the hall itself was anything special in particular as concert halls go. It had an antique Art Deco interior with the commensurate accoutrements adorning the planked stage. It had quasi-plush seating with the front center ones showing some sign of wear. There were a few VIP balconies. There was a fancy lighted marquee above the street with every bulb working and a ticket booth with an adjacent table for record sales. Typical. Located downtown at 1611 King Street, the Jamestown Concert Hall was iconic, known across the land as the place where it all started, the legend of the Lost Tuning Fork. For decades, 1611 King Street had been a bustling attraction in Jamestown and the surrounding region. The people were very proud of their orchestra and its popular Italian maestro Desiderio. Friday and Saturday nights were usually a sellout. On some days, multiple concerts and operas were performed, especially during the holiday seasons. Young and old, from far and near they would come to support their proud franchise and to be lifted with raptured delight by the latest rendering of the great classical masterpieces. The strings, the woodwind, the brass, the piano, the percussion, the vocals would all play in perfect tune and delightful harmony under the prancing and at times theatrical conducting of the elevated Maestro Desiderio, who would then turn and bow with stately poise to the thunderously applauding crowd. The patrons would go to their homes aglow with wonder and delight at what they had heard that evening at the Jamestown Concert Hall. What started, you ask? Yes, the place where it all started. What started? What happened at the concert hall? Ah, yes, of course. I'm glad you asked. This is the infamous story of the Jamestown Concert Hall, the legend of the Lost Tuning Fork. Of all the violinists in the orchestra, Mr. Nelson Van Zonder was the most celebrated. Once having gained notoriety as a celebrity in the orchestra, he went on and developed a solo fame outside of the orchestra as well. Apparently an enterprising fellow, Nelson had made quite a sum recording and selling beautiful solo renditions on his violin. Wherever the fame of the orchestra went and the incumbent profits withal, there also would be found the exclusive violin recordings of Nelson Van Zonder. One day, Nelson made a day trip to the big city where the great musicians would often go to purchase their instruments and equipment at the Westcott Music Store. As he entered the well-stocked storefront and began to muse around among the rows upon rows of handcrafted treasures, he glanced up and saw the proprietor, Mr. Westcott, gesturing towards him from the sales counter. Mr. Westcott recognized Nelson, for his fame as an independent recording artist now preceded him. Mr. Westcott gestured eagerly. wanting to show him a unique treasure he had in the office behind the sales desk. Nelson succumbed and approached the counter. They whispered briefly, then they both looked askance to see if anyone had noticed their intercourse. Then, suddenly, they sheepishly ducked into the back office to continue their conversation in private, leaving the sales desk in the care of one of the employees. After a while, Nelson emerged from the confab in the back office with a curious-looking violin case and a deviant grin on his face. "Just remember," said Mr. Westcott, as Nelson whisked out the front door, "be sure that it goes missing before you propose to Maestro Desiderio." It would appear that a shady scheme had been hatched. Ting! The instruments readied, as was their ritual, to the trusty sound from the tuning fork. Another grueling practice lay ahead. This time, however, there was a lurid air of trepidation in the empty hall that afternoon. They were preparing for a much-anticipated concert in which an exclusive audience of dignitaries were to be present. They were to visit Jamestown because the local stadium was hosting a nationwide sporting competition, and a large group of them had booked most of the seating for the concert. The fame of the orchestra was about to become national, should all go well before these esteemed visitors. It was also a big night for Nelson, as he was slated to perform a solo violin piece by Paganini. But to the ignoble Desiderio, the altruistic maestro, it was to be just another masterpiece performance. Contemned was the very thought that one audience should be more worthy of excellence than another. A proud and stalwart old-world Italian artisan was he. After a hard practice, Nelson tarried late in the building, clumsily fumbling with some wares. He was trying nonchalantly to capture an opportunity to talk with the maestro, who was always the last one to leave the hall, of course with the exception of Lancelot, the dedicated caretaker. Nelson, having brought the mysterious violin case with him that night, left it conspicuously open within the peripheral sight of the maestro. He was trying to be coy, yet hoping to catch the eye of the ever-watchful Desiderio. Succeeding, Nelson caused them to approach and to inquire as to the peculiar contents of the case. In it lay an unusual sight. Predictably, it was a violin of sorts, but it was unique. The body, the F-holes, the fingerboard and neck, and the scroll appeared in different configuration and proportion. It seemed to be an older generation of violin from a previous era of musical antiquity. "And indeed it is from another era," touted Nelson, as he gleefully plucked the instrument from the case to present it to the inquiring yet now beguiled maestro. "It is an original Stradivarius, one of his first designs, perhaps the very violin used by the original masters of a bygone age. A piece of history." It had a unique and appealing look, which set it apart from the other violins. "Need I remind you, Nelson," Desiderio pontificated, "that the modern violin has evolved through many generations of design and is today at the top of a centuries-old mastery curve?" "That is true, maestro," Nelson touted further. "Although the instrument has the limitations of an older generation design," he added a quiver to his voice, "this old-world masterpiece is an honor to tradition. It would be a great addition to our orchestra if the maestro would indulge me." "Indulge you in what?" Desiderio interrupted. "To use it for the upcoming performance?" He firmly snatched the treasure from the hands of the seemingly chagrined violinist. Desiderio trapped it squarely under his chin. He played it briefly with remarkable skill, as if he were already accustomed to the instrument. He muttered. It sounds good, and would make for a worthy homage to the great masters of the past if we were to include such a curiosity in our string section. He paused briefly, yea, perhaps too briefly. He nodded patronizingly. All right, and delivered the violin again. You can use it, but we will revisit this decision after the big event and decide if it shall continue its tenure in the orchestra or not. The hall roared with thunderous applause, another lengthy standing ovation. A large percentage of the audience were visitors from every corner of the land. Many of them had never heard a live symphony orchestra before. They were captivated. All the recordings for sale in the lobby sold out quickly. They even organized 2 more bonus concerts during their stay in town. All the tickets sold out, with record sales in the lobby each night. The orchestra, and Nelson the violinist in particular, had experienced quite a financial windfall. Of particular note, however, was the interest in the curious violin that Nelson had been playing. It was strangely appealing and gained an instant popularity among those who wished to introduce it to the musicians and orchestras in their communities back home. The demand for replicas of the curious violin went through the roof, as it was available exclusively at the Westcott Music Store. Mr. Westcott had come into quite a fortune, as orders came pouring in from around the country. But in all the euphoria over the fame that had come along, there was something unsettling. Unimpressed, Desiderio sensed something was wrong. To him, the music seemed to be off somehow. He couldn't put his finger on it right away, however. At the end of the concert, he bowed, but not with the same stately poise as usual. But alas, the thunderous response and the success that had suddenly befallen them clouded his ability to diagnose the problem quickly. After the visitors had left Jamestown, they continued their usual concert schedule to the local patrons. It seemed that Nelson's curious violin had found a permanent place in the string section. The decision to use it was never revisited. Soon the other violinist, enamored with the latest popular trend, began one by one to sport replicas from Westcott's music store. However, Desiderio became more unsettled with the sound. The strange dissonance soon began having an effect on their audience. Many sensed something off somehow, and eventually lost interest in attending the concerts. The orchestra seemed to have lost its edge, as over the ensuing weeks, ticket sales went into a decline. Meanwhile, the sales at Westcott's were skyrocketing. Around that time, Mr. Westcott visited Jamestown and attended a practice, hoping to meet with the orchestra at the concert hall. He seemed concerned about the problem they were having and appeared as if he wanted to help. Winking at Nelson, he presented another curiosity to Desiderio. It was another new instrument, this time a cello of sorts. You had a great surge of ticket sales and fame when you introduced the new violin to that national audience, analyzed Mr. Westcott. Perhaps we can reignite that same euphoria with the introduction of yet another new instrument. So the cellists laid aside their well-worn instruments and began playing the new updated version. Verily, the orchestra did see a brief surge in ticket sales as the local folks heard about the new additions to the string section. The novelty was short-lived, however, because they also noticed the dissonance, along with the ever more frustrated Desiderio. After a brief spike, the ticket sales went again into decline. The crowds thinned out quickly. Bored with the new vacancy in their entertainment schedule, many of the patrons of Jamestown began groping about for something else to fill the musical void they now experienced. Having been introduced to the strange and enchanting appeal of dissonant music style, many of them seemed to find what they sought for in the music performed at the alehouse located just across the tracks on the way out of town. It appeared that the slight dissonance in the music from the orchestra of late had created in them a strange appetite for more dissonant, disharmonic sound. So they found it at the alehouse a source of the real wholesale, full-on disharmonic sound. The dull percussion, the amplified volume, the electrical instruments, the incoherent vocals. It seemed that the once obscure alehouse had become a real competitor for the attention of the patrons of Jamestown. Eventually, as the concert hall emptied, the alehouse seemed to fill. Undaunted, Mr. Westcott came to the rescue again and again, each time providing more solutions for the frustrated orchestra, replacing the old instruments with new equipment to try to keep up with the trend of music that seemed to be making the alehouse popular. Obviously, this was a carefully crafted inversion of logic, which Mr. Westcott parlayed to his favor. Nevertheless, with the introduction of each of Mr. Westcott's new wares, there would follow only a brief pause in the rapidly declining ticket sales at the concert hall. Soon, Desiderio found himself conducting an orchestra that he hardly recognized. Amplified violins, dulled drums, electric guitars, synthesized keyboards, peculiarly robed vocalists. It was a hybrid, monstrous concoction of alehouse honky-tonk and the symphony orchestra, as if the two styles of music had undergone a head-on collision and morphed into an awkward, stumbling mutant. Before long, the musical trend in Jamestown had spread nationwide, as the orchestras, after initially embracing Mr. Westcott's curious violin, appeared to be experiencing the same spiraling conundrum in their respective communities. The only one who seemed to benefit from this upheaval was Westcott's Music Store, which erstwhile had expanded into manufacturing and quickly opened new stores in multiple cities to meet the new demand. Incidentally, Nelson also experienced an acceleration in his apparent lifestyle during that period, although no one inquired as to why. But that was no consolation for the next shoe to drop in the woeful tale of the Jamestown Concert Hall. A shadowed figure entered the auditorium and was walking down the aisle from the rear. The lights were off as a cost-saving measure. Only the stage had light, where the orchestra or band or group or whatever you called that monstrosity was practicing. There was only enough light emanating from the stage to see the man's approaching silhouette. "Maestro! Maestro! Excuse me! There is a message for you!" As the figure finally neared the lighted stage, they could see that it was Lancelot, the building caretaker. "The landlord just dropped this envelope off to me in the lobby and asked me to give it to you right away." He delivered it to Desiderio, who promptly opened it and read as the orchestra quieted their muttering and waited for what seemed to be a watershed moment. He paused. His eyes glazed over. His hand began shaking. He glibly dropped the paper to the floor as he gazed out at the anticipating musicians. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's over. The Jamestown Concert Hall has been sold to the owner of the alehouse." A quiver in the maestro's voice began. "We are to vacate the premises immediately, as renovations are to begin tomorrow." Jamestown would never be the same. The musicians, gasping with disbelief, slowly and reluctantly began packing their wares and dismantling their equipment. Forlorn, they struggled to hold back their tears, as so many decades of tradition had been siphoned into oblivion. The cavernous, empty hall seemed to grieve along with them, Desiderio sat silent, perched upon his stool, resting his chin on his fist, which in turn was pushing down through his elbow, supported by his bent knee. He looked rather like Auguste Rodin's The Thinker in a tailed tuxedo. Desiderio peered into the ubiquitous space over the heads of the despondent musicians as they scuffled aimlessly about the stage below him. "What was it that was missing?" he muttered under his breath. Why had the maestro felt unsettled for these past sordid months? Just then, as he was muttering such contemplations from his stoic perch, one of the cellists passed in front of him, stumbled, and nearly fell to the stage floor. A loose plank had been protruding up slightly and caught his passing foot. In stumbling, he pulled it completely out of place, revealing a narrow opening into the dark subfloor area under the stage. "I'm all right, folks," the cellist assured. "Besides, soon all the planks will be torn up. I guess I've helped them get started." His attempt at comic relief elicited from the others only a soft laughter, for it could not overcome their abiding sorrow. "Wait! Quiet!" The maestro jolted suddenly to his feet. "Listen! Did you hear that?" Their weak laughter immediately silenced as they inclined their ears. Out of the dark opening below came a faint sound of something that had been ringing and was nearly faded, as if it had just fallen. Desiderio peeked into the dark slot where the loose plank had been. The dim stage light reflected something made of brass laying on the concrete floor a couple of feet below. His voice gurgled, as if he was not ready to speak after such a long silence. "The tuning fork!" He cleared his throat quickly. His eyes lit up, pointing. "The tuning fork! Louder, clearer. That's it! We forgot the tuning fork!" As it had turned out, it somehow had fallen to the floor at some point in time and had landed wedged between the loose plank and the fixed one that was beside it, right over against Nelson's usual place on the stage. Awkwardly mimicking the surprised response of the others, he stepped aside as Desiderio came near. The maestro rolled up his clean white sleeve and laid prostrate over the slot, with his long, slender arm reaching for the lost item. Not able to see but only to feel about for it, his groping hand quickly clasped the cold brass tuning fork. It was still vibrating after falling from between the planks when the cellist stumbled. His now dusty, cobwebbed forearm emerged from under the stage, clasping the brightly shining tool. With a newfound reverence for the humble and forgotten item, Desiderio promenaded back to his podium. He gestured to Lancelot the caretaker, who immediately removed the loose plank out of the way and instinctively ran back to the hall to turn up the lights. As was clearly evident by his fiercely erect stature behind the elevated podium, that old-world Italian fire of music mastery returned to his eyes, which now seemed to pierce through that same ubiquitous space above the heads of the scrambling musicians. Desiderio had an epiphany. The orchestra is infiltrated with instruments that were not able to keep tune together, he realized, but he didn't say a word. It became evident just then that his epiphany seemed to transfer to all of the musicians telepathically. Without having to be instructed at all, they held their instruments aperch, ready. Ting! Desiderio struck the precious fork on the podium louder than ever. Adoringly, he held it high over the lifted heads of the starstruck orchestra. It rang with exceptional clarity and a resolute, stubborn confidence, as if it were saying, "This is the sound of truth. Hear it or depart. Love it or leave it." The crisp force of the tuning fork seemed to instantly wake them from a trance causing them to remember their long-forgotten routine procedure before playing. From left to center to the right, one by one, the instruments sounded the requested note emanating from the tuning fork. Desiderio, with the ringing tuning fork yet in hand, stepped down and slowly passed before each musician. Those that donned one of the Westcott instruments found themselves unable to tune correctly to the pealing note from the tuning fork. They quickly placed each aside, opened and dusted off their original instruments, and perched again to the ready, tuning correctly and with ease. Finally, Desiderio came to the place where Nelson sat, fixated upon the approaching ringing fork. Readied was his beloved Old World Edition Stradivarius, now partially dampened with the sweat falling from his wincing brow as he anticipated this fearful moment. This violin was the impetus. It was the instrument that had started it all. It was the cause of the floodgates of change to open and sabotage the Jamestown Orchestra. Yea, from whence the musical culture of the entire land had been shaken to its core. Ting! He hammered again, just to be clear. Nelson positioned his bow. Screech! The instrument could not tune to the clear and exacting note. Those same fiery Italian eyes glared right into the beguiling soul of Nelson, the violinist. Crestfallen, Nelson Van Zonder quickly gathered his things and retired from the stage and out the door to the back alley, never to be seen again. At last, the orchestra was purged of all the dissonant instruments. The violins, the cellos, the brass, the woodwind, the piano, the kettle drums, all the classical instruments that had evolved through centuries of perfecting, design, and fine-tuning by many generations of mastery. The original perfected orchestra was back. Desiderio returned to the podium. The all-important tuning fork was reverently placed nearby in a place of prominence to be seen and accessed often. The majestic maestro lifted his baton as the fire in his eyes grew more intense. The musicians scurried again to the ready with bated breath, waiting. There was a fleeting pause, pregnant with anticipation. It was clear. It was beautiful. It was sharp and resolute. It was harmonic. It was sweet. This sound, the joyful sound of harmony. Harmony is the very fabric of time and space itself and her many dimensions. It filled the empty hall as light vanquishes darkness. It poured out through the lobby past the smiling Lancelot and onto the street. It pealed through the streets and lanes of the town, the people hearing the wafting tones, as if memorized by the enchanting, nostalgic sound of this familiar but forgotten beauty, made their way to 1611 King Street. Lancelot, knowing what was about to transpire, had been busy unlocking the doors and preparing the building. The people seemed to float as they went straight in through the lobby, past the smiling, expectant Lancelot, leaning on his well-worn broom. They passed the empty ticket booth, into the hall where they soon filled every seat, plus the standing room. Then the lobby filled, and the sidewalk under the marquee. Restored was the beautiful tradition of harmony to Jamestown. The landlord promptly canceled the sale of the building. They hired a new violinist to replace Nelson, and the glory returned to 1611 King Street. and they never lost it again. The legend of the lost tuning fork quickly spread across the country as harmony and beauty began to be heard again in town after town. There was even a rumor that someone punched a wooden sign into the front yard of the old alehouse across the tracks. For sale, by owner, call Mr. Westcott, 666-1234. It seemed that some overlooked fine print in his return policy brought about his demise. That night, after the packed, unforgettable, and free concert finally ended, eventually the building emptied, all except Desiderio and Lancelot, the caretaker, of course. Desiderio wandered aimlessly among the chattels of the stage, reflecting on what had happened that night. Lancelot, having cleaned up the building, went to his office and fetched his hammer. He went backstage where he had temporarily stowed the loosed plank and brought it to the stage and positioned it to hammer back in place. Just then, the now brighter lighting revealed something else on the concrete floor below. It looked like a small wadded paper. Curious, he also reached in through the slot and likewise fumbled out until he clasped the paper. By the time his arm emerged, also thus soiled, Desiderio had approached the place also, wondering what it was that Lancelot had found in the slot. He opened it up and soon realized it to be a receipt of payment to Nelson Van Zonder from Mr. Westcott, a substantial commission payment for all the business Nelson generated through his scheme. The maestro, unaware that his shock had inadvertently caused him to revert to his mother tongue, proclaimed somberly, "Perché l'amor per I soldi è la radice di tutti I peccati." For the love of money is the root of all evil.